Hey everybody, KC here. So the news has been really dominated, and to a great extent, at least in my part of the world, um, by the story about the food safety controversy that is enveloping Stew Leonard's. In brief, Stew Leonard sold a cookie that was consumed by a 25-year-old woman here in Connecticut. Basically, the cookie had undeclared peanuts in it, and she died after going into anaphylactic shock. It was a private label Stew Leonard's cookie, but it was sourced from a company called Cookies United. Listen, it's a mess. And the food safety issues here are hardly unique, but they're getting a lot of play in the news. And I really wanted to learn more about this from somebody who knows a lot more about it than I do. So I turned to Roger Hancock. Roger is the CEO and president of Recall InfoLink. Full disclosure, Recall InfoLink is a Morning Newsbeat sponsor. But listen, he knows so much about this stuff, and I needed to learn more about processes. I needed to learn more about best practices. And I think that our conversation will put a couple of light bulbs on in terms of the things that retailers and manufacturers need to pay attention to in terms of due diligence. So I hope you find my conversation with Roger enlightening. Roger Hancock, welcome to Morning Newsbeat. Thanks for doing this. Um, uh, so the Stew Leonard's story about the woman who died of anaphylactic shock because she ate a cookie, private label cookie, that had undeclared peanuts in it, manufactured for stews by Cookies United. It's all over the news as we talk about this. And I really wanted to talk to you a little bit about the notion of process and best practices. So as you've been reading these stories, you know, do you have a sense of where process might have fallen down, recognizing that all the problems were before there was a recall, and recalls are your specialty, but you know more about this stuff than anybody else I know.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me. And I would be remiss if I didn't start by expressing my condolences to the family of the woman who died and the tragedy of the whole situation. It's really tragic. And hopefully next time we talk, it's on a little bit lighter circumstances. Yeah, there are some process steps that the whole supply chain needs to look at, because undeclared allergens aren't infrequent recalls. Even though there's been a law in place since 2006 that says you have to declare allergens if they fall into these 8 categories, still there are far too many recalls related to undeclared allergens. And so I think...
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you. Could you put a number on that? What does that mean? They happen frequently. I mean, daily, weekly, monthly? How many are there?
Yeah, so Sedgwick does a nice report, and in the third quarter of 23, they reported more than 50 recalls during the 13-week third quarter period, more than 50 recalls due to undeclared allergens. That's
several a week.
Several a week, and by far the biggest single cause of recalls, even now in 2023, which is, 17 years after the law went into effect. Yeah. And it's the reason I say it's a supply chain problem is because labels have their own supply chain, and they get printed, they get reviewed, they get approved, and then they get placed. All that review and approval and printing happens before they're put on the product, and lots of things can happen to the product between the time the label is approved and printed and the time the product actually is on the shelf in somebody's store. And so I think that, one of the things that this story really points to is a need for an increased due diligence on that supply chain process, so that there's a greater sense of accuracy on the product that ends up in the store on the shelf for consumers to buy.
That's interesting. So we all think of supply chain as being product, but in fact, information has its own supply chain.
It does. Packaging has its own supply chain. Information has its own supply chain. And you mentioned, a recall is a fixing a problem that's gone too long, if there were these due diligence processes in place along the way, there would have been no reason for a recall, because the alignment between the label and the product would have been solved earlier in the whole flow of things.
So the folks at Cookies United say that they sent an email to 11 people at Stew Leonard's on July 20th, 2023. And basically the letter says, this letter is to inform you that the below listed items have had a change of ingredients and now contain peanuts. All labels have been updated. Therefore, these cookies that now contain peanuts have been labeled accordingly. Chocolate Florentine cookie and the vanilla Florentine cookie. And then they attached to their press release both the labels that were on the individual packaging and the cases. And it says peanuts. And to be clear, our understanding of it is, I mean, even this is what Stew Leonard says, nobody told our chief safety officer. It's unclear whether any of the 11 people they sent the email to was in fact the chief safety officer. And then Stew takes those cookies out of those packaging, puts it in its own packaging, puts its own label, and sells it as private label. Common. So is that best practices to just send an email to 11 people in a company, is with peanuts mentioned in it in boldface, but just mentioned in the text? Is that good enough?
Well, it's easy to say that apparently in this case it wasn't.
Okay.
Whether or not it's a best practice, what it points to is something that we experience all the time. The transaction between who makes the label at Cookies United and the buyer at Stew Leonard's isn't necessarily the right transaction to affect the change that needs to happen. Now, you can say Cookies United said we sent it to 11 people. I don't know who those 11 people are. I don't know what position they're in. And Stew is saying, my chief food safety officer didn't get this message, implying that if the chief food safety officer had received the message, then action would have been taken. So there's this supply chain reality that when things go wrong, the communications happen through the established communication channels, which often isn't the right channel for the action that needs to happen. So I can't comment on either Cookies United process or Stew Leonard's process, but I can say that often we see a disconnect between the company that's sending the message and the company that's receiving the message, because it's ending up in the wrong email box. It's ending up in the wrong hard mail box.
Yeah.
It's giving instructions that the person receiving the message just doesn't understand.
And maybe 4 or 5 months before those products were even going to find their way on the shelf.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember years ago doing a recall of some pesticide products in California because one of the ingredients was banned. And these pesticides were cyclical, they were seasonal. And we ended up selling the same pesticides the next year because they were in transit and supply. They arrived, the recall had already been completed. So the product wasn't labeled recalled product. It was put upstairs and waiting for the next season. So these timing things, there's all kinds of things, all kinds of factors, market factors that can affect the sale of wholesome product, and due diligence really is the only way to guard against that.
Yeah. Based on sort of your understanding of the regulations, it is beyond the fact that you're right, the process obviously broke down somewhere. Is just sending that email enough? Does it to satisfy what the law requires? If we assume that Cookies United sent the letter that they said they sent.
Well, I'm not aware of a law that requires communication. I'm aware that there's a law that requires accurate, truthful labeling. And so how the process, and companies have labeling experts.
Right.
They hire people who that's their job, is to make sure the labels are compliant. How it flows down the supply chain, I'm not aware. Well, I would say that Cookies United, it looked to be labeling their product accurately. If the labels that they put in that document that you referred to are the labels that were on the product, it appears that they declare the allergens.
Yeah.
How that gets translated to Stew Leonard's for relabeling, I'm not aware of a law that governs that.
If it would strike me that I'm a civilian, right? But it would strike me that if the law does not have specific dictates in terms of how this information is communicated, frankly, it should. Because I read that and I said, okay, emails are emails. But it would seem to me that, for example, especially if you're adding an allergen, right, into an acknowledged allergen into a product, whether it's peanuts, eggs, whatever it happens to be, that didn't have it before. I mean, at the very least, it strikes me that what ought to be required, I'm not saying it is required, but what should be required is that you send a registered letter, receipt required, to the chief food safety officer at that retailer, right? So at the very least, you can say, hey, I know I sent this letter and I know he got that letter.
Well, I think I'm just gonna
push back if you want.
I'm gonna jokingly pull you into 2024,
right?
Because sending registered letters isn't necessarily the most efficient way, but closing the loop on the communication is exactly the dynamic that you're pointing to, and that's exactly correct. The loop needs to be closed. There needs to be, a read receipt that the email was opened. There should even be some confirmation back. Okay, I got your message and I took some action. When we process recalls, that's exactly what we want the supply chain to be doing. We want the supply chain to be saying, here's the specific information that you can act on. Let us know that you've taken those actions, and close that loop, close the communication loop, and close the product handling loop.
And by the way, that's not hard. If I'm communicating by email with somebody that I need to know that they got the email that I sent them for whatever reason, the last line of the email is, please confirm to me that you have received this email. And if I don't get a confirmation in a couple of days, I resend it. I just, I want to make sure you got this.
Yeah. And you could even say, and taken the action requested.
So is are there, I guess to me, when I read about this, I mean, one of the things, I mean, there's a lot of issues here, right? There's the food safety issues, which we've talked about. There's going to be legal issues. I'm sure, you got to assume that at both Stew Leonard's and at Cookies United, everything they say is being dictated by attorneys, right? Because they want to be careful. They have to be careful. But then there's also communications issues in terms of how you deal with customers. And I'll address that elsewhere on Morning Newsbeat. But to me, the gold standard of this is Tylenol. That they dealt with it quickly and decisively, and there were multiple deaths in that case. That they had to move very quickly to regain trust, and that's something that I mean, nobody had ever heard of Cookies United before now, but lots of people had heard about Stew Leonard's. So Stew Leonard's is the company that's got to worry about reestablishing trust among its consumers.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And the way we're approaching this is these things are rarely single company issues. They really are supply chain issues. And these trading partners are expert at communicating and moving product forward. They're not so skilled necessarily at moving product backward. It's kind of like a fire drill. It's an unusual action that isn't part of anybody's job. And so mapping out a way that customizes the communication and closes the loop that you talk about and gets response that action's been taken is vital to reducing allergen label, undeclared allergen recalls. It's essential to continued improvement, process improvement in the way the supply chain is kept safe. Yeah, I totally agree that a better communication flow is going to solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, listen, I think the thing for me, the light bulb that has gone on over my head just in this conversation is the notion that information has its own supply chain. Because I don't think people think of it that way. And that
Yeah,
and that could be as big a problem as, or in some cases, a bigger problem than the supply chain that moves product from place to place to place.
it's great insight, Kevin, because selling groceries is now as much a data activity as it is a product activity. And people don't make that transition real easily. To think of selling groceries as data. Well, groceries are groceries, aren't they?
Right.
Well, no, groceries have UPC, they have barcodes, and there's a lot of data now that drives the sale of products, that drives grocery and food retailing.
So if either, and granted, we don't know everything yet, right?
For sure.
It's an unfolding story. But if either Stew Leonard's or Cookies United came to you and say, "Hey, listen, this is a nightmare scenario for us. How do we how do we address this both systemically and also in terms of what do you think we need to do to avoid this happening again in the future? What would you recommend?"
Well, the first part of the question is much easier to answer because what you do to prepare for these things is you practice.
Right.
And you practice as a supply chain activity, not just as a company activity, so that Cookies United knows if there's a problem, this is what we expect you to do to inform us. And this is what we're going to do to inform our stores. Also, what we're going to do to inform our consumers. There's a lot of activity right now being focused in the recall space around better consumer notification. And one conversation I had, the FDA was not only interested in consumers being notified, but in consumers taking action. Because an email is no good as just an email if the action that the email or the text message request isn't taken. So I would say, for the first part of your question, do some due diligence around your process as a supply chain process, realizing that everybody in your supply chain needs a little bit different information at a little bit different time to do the right thing. The second part of your question, I can only answer generally, and that's, as a retailer, there are information flows, there are product flows, and both of those need due diligence around how the flow serves you as a company and how the flow serves your customer. And if the data flow isn't serving your customer very well, then you need to take some action to improve your data flow. And sometimes that is way more challenging than improving your process flow. And a good example of that is, the FSMA 204 Food Labeling Act that is, 2006 active date. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around data to track the products. And so it's connecting products and data. So my recommendation is, a little bit keener eye on due diligence on both the data side and the product side.
Well, at some level, this has got to be a wake-up call for, frankly, every manufacturer and every retailer, because, Stew Leonard's doesn't have that many stores. And however the breakdown happened, it happened. And if you're a bigger, whether you're much bigger, whether you have thousands of stores or you have 3 stores, the potential for this kind of breakdown is still there. And so it would seem to me to be, table stakes right now that everybody has to redouble their efforts to make sure that wherever the breakdown took place, it does not happen again.
You point to another really insightful issue, Kevin, because what we see is company size isn't a real good indicator of preparedness for these types of activities. Sometimes the biggest companies in the world aren't very well prepared to give their customers the right information to take the right actions. And so On the other hand, a small company might do it perfectly. So just because you're a big company or a small company doesn't mean you're necessarily insulated. It means you need to ask the questions and you need to take the steps.
Well, I think the bottom line is due diligence constantly, and information is its own supply chain. And I think if we can get people to pay more attention to that, at least we'll have taken a step in the right direction.
Because lives are at stake. I mean, that is the fundamental issue here, is lives are at stake. And so a little bit of extra effort to protect lives is well worth the cost.
Roger, I thank you for your insights. I really appreciate it. And we will see you down the road.
Very good. Thank you,
Take care.
Kevin.